So what I want to do is I want to talk about how student funding policies have changed over time, some of the effects of the most recent changes, and then look at some of the assumptions underpinning the funding system that we have, and whether those assumptions are well placed or whether in fact they're erroneous. So let's look at the changing funding system in England. So this is a story exclusively about undergraduate students in England, not the whole of the UK. And as you'll see, it's a very particular story because England, in terms of its student funding system, is an outlier relative to other European countries and other countries in the OECD. So there have been various phases and various developments to student funding policies. Prior to 1998, higher education was free, there were no tuition fees, and poor students got grants for help towards their living costs. But the first change came in 1990. Now that was important because loans were introduced for the first time. So the change that was introduced in 1990 was important because it set up a universal system of loans for full-time students. And secondly, it established loans as an entitlement for all undergraduate students, irrespective of their family background. The second shift that was important was in 1998, when tuition fees were introduced for the first time. And also, income contingent loans were introduced. Loans whereby the repayments are linked to graduates' earnings when they complete their studies. And then finally, in 2004, and it was instituted in 2006, we see that tuition fees have been increased to £3,000 a year, but all students have to pay these fees, and they are repaid via income contingent loans. And then the final set of reforms happened in 2012-2013. Now these reforms are very radical because the first thing that happens is that all the money that universities, or nearly all the money that universities get for teaching undergraduate students is withdrawn. And instead of universities getting money from the government, instead they are allowed to increase tuition fees up to £9,000, that's nearly 11,000 euros. And students can repay for those much higher tuition fees through income contingent loans. And also students get loans for their living costs as well. So this is a very radical change, and loans have allowed, the introduction of these loans have allowed for massive increases in levels of tuition fees. Loans have made that increase in tuition fees both socially and politically more acceptable. And again, England is an outlier because both the level of tuition fees and the amount of debt that students graduate with are the highest in nearly all the world, certainly amongst all OECD countries. So let's look at some of the ideas underpinning these reforms. What's important to note is the way in which the key rationale behind these changes was firstly to provide a system of funding that was financially sustainable. Secondly, to improve the student experience. And thirdly, to increase social mobility. So these changes built on existing provision and consolidated key elements in the evolving rationale for a higher education finance system that featuring student choice and the marketisation of higher education. So the 2012 regime broke new ground in relation to the withdrawal of direct government funding for teaching and their replacement with higher tuition fees. Because according to the white paper, block grants to universities for teaching stifled growth, stifled competition, and limited student choice. So funding must follow the students. So in essence, student loans act as a voucher, as an educational voucher, that students can redeem at the institution of their choice. Moreover, what the white paper suggests is that by putting financial power into the hands of learners, this makes choice meaningful. It also argued that we want to ensure that the new student finance regime supports students' choice, and that in turn, student choice drives competition between institutions, including on price. In fact, that never happened. All institutions charged the maximum they were allowed to charge, namely £9,000. So there's been no competition on choice. Sorry. The next slide helps us understand the benefits of income contingent loans. Now, for the rest of my presentation in a minute, I'm going to criticise income contingent loans. However, relative to other loan systems, which are not related to graduates' income, I would argue that income contingent loans are far better than the majority of other loan systems, including in the United States, which we may hear about subsequently. So there are really good things about income contingent loans, even if I'm going to criticise them. And how the income contingent system works is that the repayments depend on students' graduate earnings when they finish their studies. The more they earn, the more they pay. In other words, the repayments are progressive. But graduates only start to repay when their earnings reach a certain threshold. At the moment, that threshold is £25,000, which is basically the median earnings in England. And once they reach that earnings threshold, they pay 9% of their earnings above that threshold. So if they're earning £30,000, they pay 9% on £5,000. And they continue to repay their loans until they've either finished or 30 years after they started to repay. After 30 years of repayment, any outstanding loan is forgiven. It's ignored. And these repayments are deducted directly from students' pay packet. In other words, the loan repayments are taken out of their salary through the tax system, which makes the administration of the system also very efficient and very easy, again, relative to other systems. But, and you can hear there's a but in my voice, but let's have a look at this quote in a bit more detail. Let's look at some of the assumptions underpinning the benefits of income contingent loans. The first thing is the way in which they're presented as fair. Because the repayments are related to earnings, they're perceived to be fair. The loan repayments are also perceived to be affordable because they're linked to earnings and therefore protect graduates against financial hardship. And consequently, they are risk-free. It's also assumed that the total amount of debt doesn't matter because repayments are based not on how much they borrow. The repayments are based exclusively on their earnings. So in America, for example, most loans, the repayment levels, they're repaid over a standard 10-year period, and the amount that is repaid depends on how much you borrowed and the interest on the borrowing. But under income contingent loans, the amount you repay doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much you borrowed. Your repayments will be the same whether you borrow £10 or £100,000 because the repayments are linked to earnings. And these insurance features of income contingent loans suggest that students should not be debt averse. The problem with debt aversion is that if students understood properly how income contingent loans worked, they wouldn't be scared of debt. They wouldn't think that student loan debt is like any other form of debt. So, what has been the impact of the changes? The first impact is that the vast majority of students now, if they want to go to university, they have to borrow. They have no choice. Indeed, 85% of undergraduate students take out loans to pay for their tuition, and 90% take out loans for maintenance. So we have a situation whereby all students qualify for loans, and the vast majority of students actually take them out. And these loans for tuition cover all their fees. Yeah? And the loans for maintenance towards their living costs cover part of their living costs, but not all their living costs. So what this means is that over time, the amount of debt that a student graduates with has grown. The average level of debt that a student can expect to graduate with is £47,000. However, poorer students end up with higher levels of debt than richer students. And that is because England abolished all grants. The only form of financial support sponsored by the government that a student can now get is a loan. And because poorer students are allowed to borrow more towards their cost of living, they end up leaving university with higher debts. The other thing is because of the very high level of debt that graduates end up having, their earnings throughout their working life are not going to be large enough to repay all their debts. Indeed, it's estimated that about 83% of students will not have paid off their loans within 30 years. In other words, what that means in reality is that the vast majority of students will be repaying their student loans for most of their working lives. So student debt isn't some short-term event in a graduate's life. It's something that happens throughout their working life. The other issue is that actually these loans are very expensive for the government too. For every £100 it gives a student, it can only expect to receive back £53. In other words, there is a subsidy from the government of 47%. Now, I want to bring these issues together, and I want to look in more depth at the assumptions underpinning the benefits of income contingent loans. First, as I think we've seen, it's been argued that income contingent loans are fair and affordable because they won't lead to any financial hardship. The second assumption is that income contingent loans are risk-free because repayments are linked to ability to pay. It is the government, not the student, who bears the risk of a graduate having low income once they graduate, of getting a low-paid jobs. So the student doesn't take on that risk, it's the government that takes on that risk. Hence that very big subsidy that we're seeing. Thirdly, it's assumed that the total amount of debt doesn't matter, that how much students borrow doesn't matter, because repayments are linked to earnings. And anyway, any outstanding debt is forgiven after 30 years. Consequently, it's assumed that students should not worry about debt. They shouldn't worry about how much debt they leave university with. As Nicholas Barr, who's a very important economist from the LSE, who's had a major influence on the development of loans in England, argues, income contingent loans are a payroll deduction. They're not debt. Students and their parents shouldn't worry. Students and their parents shouldn't worry and don't worry about how much tax they pay over their lifetime. Nobody worries about that. So why should they worry about student loans and the total amount that they borrow? In other words, being debt averse is irrational, and if prospective students understood how loans worked, they wouldn't be debt averse. And for all these reasons, it is also assumed that loans won't negatively affect students' choices. They won't affect their choices about where they go to university, whether they go to university, that loans actually give students positive choices. They expand students' choices. And so it's similarly assumed that the insurance dynamics of loans means that they'll have a minimal impact on students' post-graduation choices and behaviour too. That loans will have few, if any, consequences for graduates. So that ultimately what loans do is they promote the private benefits and wider economic and social benefits of higher education. Now, I want to question these in more depth. Sorry. So let's assess some of these assumptions. The first assumption is, as I say, that there's no debt aversion. But actually, I would argue that the government adopts a very narrow understanding of debt aversion and assumes that there are no differences in attitudes towards debt. But indeed there are. And attitudes towards debt vary enormously by students' backgrounds. What government policy does is to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to policy. It's assumed that all students are young, that they're single, that they're upper and middle class come from upper and middle class backgrounds, and that they are first-time entrants into the labour market. That they are comfortable about taking on large debt because their families are very familiar with debt-based investments, and they anticipate getting very good and high-paying jobs when they graduate. And yet what research shows is that working class students are very concerned about their ability to pay off debt and are very concerned about taking out loans. And we know that the financial returns to higher education vary considerably by student characteristics, by the subjects they study, by the institutions that they attend, by their social class, and that there has been an increasing dispersion between the top and bottom earners, and that's been growing over time. So actually higher education is a risky investment, and that makes loans risky as well. And this is confirmed in a piece of research that I fairly recently conducted. I undertook a study of a representative sample of prospective higher education students. So these were students, all of whom were taking a qualification that meant they could enter into higher education. So I undertook that study in 2002. I repeated that study in 2015, using many of the same or similar questions. And what we found is that between 2002 and 2015, and by the way, those students in 2015 had a very good understanding of how student loans worked. They understood the income contingent nature of those loans. So what did we find? Well, we found that over time, students' attitudes towards debt were more relaxed. They were more favourable. But lower class students were still more debt averse than upper class students in 2015 than in 2002. And lower class students were far more likely than students from any other social class to not to apply to go to university because of their fear of debt. And that's when we control for lots of different things. We control for their past educational attainment, we control for gender, we control for a whole range of factors. So lower class students' fear of debt is far more likely to deter them from entering into higher education in 2015 than in 2002. So actually, attitudes towards debt at one level have become more entrenched over time, specifically amongst those from the lowest income backgrounds. So there's little doubt that debt aversion is alive and kicking. And concerns about the costs of higher education and fear of debt don't stop just in terms of decisions about whether or not to enter higher education. It's quite clear that there's mounting evidence that students select their institution, their higher education, so that they can economize on their living costs, or that they can minimize the level of debt, or actually avoid taking out debt. And indeed, what research suggests is that living at home while at university, or being near your parental home, is a very common strategy used. Now, in Portugal and in Spain and in many European countries, this is the norm anyway. Students tend not to live away from home. But in England, 80% of students, undergraduate students, leave their parental home to go to university. So that is the norm. So if student funding is preventing students from doing that, in a context of England,
where that's the norm and that matters and is seen to matter, then it's important. And indeed, a recent study that we've just undertaken, looking at the take-up of student loans, shows that actually, as this graph illustrates, the wealthier the student, the less likely they are to take out a student loan. And that's to be expected. So when we use various indicators of income and wealth, the wealthiest students from the wealthiest backgrounds don't take out loans. But what's quite interesting is the gap amongst poorer students in terms of the take-up of different types of loans, loans for tuition fees and loans for maintenance. And what's interesting is the gap with maintenance loans. What's happening here is there's strong evidence that poorer students are not taking out maintenance loans, that dotted line, because they're choosing to live at home. And it's not just low-income students, it's also students who are first in the family to go to university, ethnic minorities, mature students. They only consider their local higher education institution limiting their options of which university they can go to. It's fine if they live in London. In London, you know, you can choose from the best to the worst university. You can choose to go to a conservatoire. You can choose to go to the best university for studying fine arts. But if you're living in the north of England in a small town, or in the east of England in a small town, your options are going to be very limited if you can only go to your local higher education institution. And what's so important when we look at which student groups are affected by student loan debt and debt aversion, the choices, the choices and the mobility of students, it is those who are already disadvantaged. So the already disadvantaged are becoming more disadvantaged. How am I for time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay.
10
huh?
If you need.
Okay. So, what I would argue is that government student loan policies encapsulate a very narrow conceptualization of choice. Students are conceptualized as rational calculators, primarily weighing up the costs and the benefits of going to higher education and weighing up the relative costs and benefits of the quality of different institutions and their courses. The greater choice afforded by student loans, as proposed by government, is seen as something fair and desirable. But I would argue that it builds on and extends social disadvantage. It leads to greater social inequality and helps to legitimate that inequality. Because we know that what the government would label as suboptimal choices, i.e. bad choices, are not random. They are socially stratified. And so what we do is when a student makes a bad choice, i.e. chooses a bad university, and we actually have a minister, I could show you a speech, who is saying that basically students make bad decisions. They choose the wrong university and they choose the wrong subject. And what that speech shows is the way in which we blame the victim for making a bad choice. And this applies to post-graduation choices too. So the last two assumptions that I want to look at, sorry.
It's okay.
Yep. The last two assumptions I want to look at is that loans have a minimal impact on post-graduation behavior and choices. such as their labour market outcomes, housing, family formation, etc. And consequently, that loans leave untouched the economic and social benefits associated with higher education. These two assumptions encapsulate most of my current research. They matter because we know, as I already suggested, we know that most graduates will be repaying their loans for most of their working lives. So what are some of the longer-term consequences of having student loan debt on graduates' lives and on graduates' choices? And so what I'm trying to do with my current research is to explore the lived reality of student loan debt in England. And the first thing that we've done is we've looked at the impact on their labour market outcomes. And this is for graduates at the age of 25. What we have examined is the strength of the association between student loan debt and labour market outcomes. Namely, what sort of job these young graduates have got, whether the job is a permanent job or a temporary job, whether it's a so-called graduate job, in other words, are they using their HE qualification, and their earnings. And of these, only underemployment is found to be associated with taking out a loan, with borrowing, while attitudes towards debt are related to all the outcomes except job permanency. So taking out a loan, whether or not you have a loan, only influences whether or not you're in a graduate job. But if you have negative attitudes towards student loan debt, then you're far more likely, or less likely, to have a graduate job, to have a high-level job, and to have high earnings. So, what our findings suggest are two interesting things. Actually, our findings do support positively some of the benefits of income contingent loans. The fact that just having taken out a loan doesn't affect earnings, doesn't affect borrowing, doesn't affect whether or not you're in a permanent job, doesn't affect the level of the job, but does affect whether or not you're in a graduate job, does suggest that the protective elements of student income contingent loans are working. That's a good story. The not so good story is the mere fact that attitudes towards debt affect the sort of job that students get once they leave, is that it affects the psychological burden of carrying debt. So the financial burden of debt isn't so great because the income contingent loans protect students against that because their repayments are linked to their earnings. What income contingent loans don't do is affect what it feels like to have a debt on your shoulder, to be carrying debt, to know that you actually owe £50,000 and you've got to pay it off. What the loan system doesn't do is ameliorate that. So, because what it shows is that what graduates were doing is that they were taking the first job available that they could find to start to repay their loans, irrespective of the characteristics of those jobs. So what our findings show is that overall, student loans do affect graduates' labour market choices and perpetuate inequalities between graduates with and without student loan debt. Our findings also show that student loans which aim to promote higher education access and the private and social benefits associated with higher education, namely higher earnings and better employment opportunities, are undermined by student loans. And this matters because our promise to students when they enter our door, our promise is that they're going to end up with a high-level, high-paying, secure graduate job. In other words, student loans help to undermine some of the private and economic benefits of higher education. And finally, our current research is looking at the impact of student loans on home ownership. And what it's suggesting is that, and home ownership at the age of 25, that's very young. Even I, with no graduate, with no loans, I didn't get my first apartment until I was 30. But then I didn't go to university till I was 25 either, because whatever. So what do our findings show? Well, in terms of home ownership, our initial findings suggest that students who went to university but didn't take out a loan are far more likely to own their own home at the age of 25 than students who went to university and didn't take out a loan. But actually, while there's a difference, there's no evidence that attitudes towards debt or the amount owned are associated with home ownership. Indeed, what's interesting is that the patterns of housing tenure between those who went to university and had loans is far more similar to those who never went to university, bringing into question some of the economic benefits of higher education. The other thing that we've looked at, it's the end. The other thing that we have looked at is the phenomenon of living with parents. Now, as I suggested, most students go away to university to study. But what's happening now is that they're coming back to mummy and daddy after they finish their studies. And this is a growing trend in England. And what we found is that the more debt-averse students were, the more they disliked having student debt, the more likely they were to be living with their parents. And the key reason that they were living at home with mum and dad was because that they couldn't afford alternative forms of housing. And the amount of debt that they had mattered in terms of their reasons for living with mum and dad. So young people's transition to adulthood, signified by the milestones of leaving home and home ownership, are being delayed or undermined by student funding policies and student loan debt, which may have long-term implications for family formation and ultimately the reproduction of human capital. So, what I hope I have... Okay? No. What I hope I've shown is that student loans can be unfair, unaffordable, and risky. That the total amount of debt is relevant, debt aversion is not irrational, that loans don't necessarily promote good choices, and that loans can have a negative impact on post-graduation behaviour and life choices, whereby the economic and the social and political benefits of higher education and the freedoms associated with higher education may be undermined by student loans. Thank you.